Hello, and welcome back to Iron Age Wales, Episode 6, The Art and Craftsmanship of the Iron Age. So, before we get started this week, I just wanted to quickly have a mention that last week we missed an episode. This episode specifically was supposed to come out last week if you're listening to this on the day of release. This was due to a computer malfunction on my part, and it took almost 5 days to fix. So, by the time it was fixed on Wednesday, that was a little late to record. So we're recording now. Get this out when it comes out, and we may compress another episode later this week to kind of catch us back up to where we were. We might not. I don't know. I haven't decided yet. So if we skip an episode and move, well, we're not going to skip an episode, but if we skip a week and just move on from there on, you'll know why we did that. But yes, we had some computer problems, and they just kind of rolled in on themselves as sometimes happens. So it's a whole brand new setup. You may not know that, but it is. Anyway, with all that said and done, how about we get to the episode, shall we? One of the defining features of Iron Age Welsh art is the masterful use of bronze. The ability to cast, shape, and engrave this metal allowed artisans to produce details and decorative objects that were both functional and symbolic. We have discussed to a small degree some of what was used and why. In other episodes in the past, we talked a little bit about the use of different metal casts and designs for religious worship, or at least what we believe is religious worship. But I wanted to go further into that and discuss even further some of the artistry and how these Iron Age British peoples created and designed things if we don't necessarily always understand why or how. And we'll talk about specific instances, some of which you can find if you go to the British Museum or to the museums in Cardiff as examples. It is an interesting twist as the everyday use of metal in this period switches from bronze to iron. Your hoes, your axes, your weapons, shields all have iron in them to protect people. Armor starts to get iron involved in it, and we move away from bronze as something you would use on the day to day, simply because it isn't as strong as or as durable. But iron has, while it has that appeal, it takes a lot of work to make it shiny and bright, and it quickly gathers kind of a darker look fairly quickly. Now, we might look at it and say, wow, they still look wonderful. And stainless steel, of course, changes the design and look of things to make it brighter and shinier. But if you look at iron in its more regular standpoint of things, especially, it does take on a much darker look. Whereas the brighter looking metals, such as copper and gold, continue to hold that appearance longer. And in the case of copper, it will and can be much more flexible and easier to use in these artistic ways. And so, as an example, the British Museum houses many outstanding examples of this bronze craftsmanship, including elaborate horse harness fittings, mirrors, which were very much used in how people see themselves in various things. And don't get me wrong, mirrors are important to our look and appearance. So you can imagine the previous time periods would use metals for that because it's obvious you can look into the reflection of yourself on various types of metal. So it would make sense that bronze would be one of those metals. And along with that, these weapons were adorned with swirling patterns and animal and plant life designs. These objects revealed a deep appreciation for fluid and organic forms that seemed almost alive. This, of course, comes from the Latine artistic tradition, which has been spreading across Europe at this stage and influences much of British Iron Age art. It is characterized, of course, as I said, from flowing curvilinear motifs, often incorporating animal and plant imagery. These designs are very much the norm of this period. The one thing that you see during this time period, which I think is quite fascinating, is if you look in the Mediterranean and other places such as that, in Egypt and in the Middle East, the use of design that looks much more humanoid and has more human forms to it, or even mixed human animal forms in Egypt, does not appear in our Celtic cultures that we're talking about in Britain. So you have a narrower design frame from, say, the anthropomorphic design. Yes, there are examples of, say, pigs and things of that nature that we can find that were obviously used in decoration. That idea, the boar, is actually kind of a symbolic thing that's used a couple of different ways. But at the same time, if you compare that to the swirls and to the use of vegetation, especially vines and flowers, which are way more common across all of these art pieces, displays of authority and power, they're much more common. And so, in a way, it kind of shows that it was much more in vogue. Now, could this change? Sure. And it does when the Romans come, obviously. But it's not something that is the same as what we've seen elsewhere, which I think is fascinating to kind of see how that cultural shift migrates. Now, again, doesn't mean there aren't humanoid style design choices, but I would argue that they're not as widespread, I guess is how I would describe it. The British version of Celtic art, particularly during the Iron Age, is renowned for its intricate designs and symbolic motifs. Experts suggest that these designs offer a window into the beliefs and societal structures of the time. According to the National Museum of Wales, for example, quote, Celtic art reflects the way Iron Age people interpreted the world around them. The designs that were used help us to understand how they viewed themselves and their environments and their gods, end quote. One notable artifact is the beautifully decorated bronze mirror found in Wales, which is now housed in that very same National Museum, Cardiff. These mirrors were not simply grooming tools, they may have also been symbols of status, identity, and possibly even used for divination rituals. Think of Snow White, where we have the mirror, mirror on the wall. That isn't the same, but you know what I mean. Like looking into the mirror and trying to divine things out of it as if you're seeing through a looking glass is something that is popular even going into the 19th century in America. That concept of being able to see visions out of things or people or sites that you don't necessarily know is very popularized and what is called treasure hunting, which happens in the early 1800s in the areas of New England in America. So this isn't something that's uncommon. It's something that's very common for many, 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 many years throughout the lifetime of humanity. So you can see why they would make that assumption that these things didn't just perform everyday rich ideas, but also had ritualistic ideas. I would also counter argue that quite frequently archaeologists love to find ritual. I mean, it's great. You can always pin something down on ritual. Well, they did this because it was a ritual. It's not, oh, they were throwing their bones out into a pit because they were done eating. Not saying they wouldn't be ritualized, but you know what I mean. It's one of those things where you kind of find is a very popular decision point for some archaeologists. I don't think it's always that way, but I think there is kind of a thought process that says, well, they must have done it because X, Y, Z. And if there's one thing I try to do here throughout this podcast is I'm trying to point out that yes, it could be that way, but just because we see it in one culture doesn't mean it's the same in all cultures, and it doesn't mean the way something happened here equals the way something happened there. So in other words, native communities in the place where I live would look at heights as being holy places. Quite frequently, they would bury their dead in some of the cliff faces in an area I used to live in. And that was a common process and a decision. Does that mean that's the exact same thing or the exact same reason or they understood things the same way as we did in Wales? And I say we because it's my ancestors too, who lived there and made those decisions back in, say, 3000 BCE or 500 BCE if we go into the Iron Age? No, not necessarily. So we can't say it's a one-to-one comparison. I think that's very speculative. I think we can take some cultural ideas from that, but I think going that far, I think is stretching it. I think you can't measure one to the other because we just don't know enough about them unless we were able to take a time machine back and go spend some time in ancient Londinium or its precursor or on some Iron Age hill fort in 300 BCE in the middle of North Wales. I just don't think we'll know. And even assumptions are just that, and interpretations always change. The thing to keep in mind is that archaeology is never just a single thing. I mean, if we thought that one discovery and one conclusion was the end all be all, you wouldn't have people finding other discoveries and then comparing it to that discovery and then starting to say, hey, maybe this isn't that. It's very easy to make and jump to conclusions. And so we need to be careful about that. So that's kind of my qualification throughout all this discussion, is that there's no way to know for sure, but we can make assumptions based on what other people do and say. So that's why I say when they discuss these things and what they may or may not have been used for, maybe is how I would describe it. Another fascinating example with these kind of design choices is another fascinating example is the Cerrig shield discovered in North Wales. This bronze shield, adorned with repousse work, demonstrates not only the technical skill of the maker, but it also is a significance for such an object to be found that is both presented as an object of warfare, but also of ceremony. The shield was not merely a practical tool for protection, but were also status symbols and possibly even offerings to gods. This artistic tradition, which comes from the early Celtic periods prior to this, influenced much of Britain's Iron Age art, is characterized by flowing motifs, often incorporating animals and plant imagery. This style is evident in various artifacts discovered in Wales, such as the Celtic plaque from Cyn Cerrig Bach in Anglesey, which features an elaborate triskele design. The triskele or triskelion symbol, as we mentioned in a previous episode, is also commonly found across Europe and was first found on Malta during the Neolithic period. That's the late Stone Age. The second discovery was found in an astronomical calendar from a megalithic tomb in Newgrange in Ireland, built around 3200 BCE. This design looks similar to our Iron Age British designs. In Mediterranean cultures, however, the triskelion appears to be represented mostly by three legs bent at the knee, rotating around a central point where they're all attached. Very similar, if you've seen it, to the flag of the Isle of Man. That is a triskelion. As Celtic cultures of Austria and Switzerland began to design with these particular ideas, it seemed that they stylized the design to make it into a spiral or circle format revolving around a central point. While there was a lot of interpretation of what the meaning of this particular item is, I'm not sure we can take it as any confirmation in how it's used in ancient Britain. Myths and legends can say a lot, but if they're coming thousands of years after the design, it's almost impossible to know whether that's what they really meant. So when people say, oh, we know exactly what that means, it means this, da 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 da, for sure, for sure, for sure, keep in mind that they may or may not be talking from a perspective of having read someone's book who made an interpretation, or worse yet, are coming from circles of misinformation that have been developed by people who are trying to create a history, such as Geoffrey Monmouth or our good buddies from the late 18th century who made a habit of writing things that weren't necessarily accurate in their own interpretations on how the world worked back in the Iron Age. All of those people have to be taken with a grain of salt, so that interpretation may or may not be accurate. So keep that in mind, and when you're doing your own personal look into these type of things, I'd always encourage you to look at scholars and other scholars, because somebody writing in 1900 is going to have a very different opinion than someone writing in 2000 or even someone writing in 2025. All of these interpretations can and will change, and it's important to remember that. As perspective changes, other finds change our interpretation, and all of that, as I've said many, many times, including in this episode, affect how to perceive these things. So let's keep an open mind, I guess is what I would say, about where things have come from and why. From there, this design, however, was used across Europe, and it makes its way into Britain and Ireland during this period as a major feature of design. There were examples of triskelly stone fragments discovered in Gloucestershire, though, that predate this to the Neolithic period and possibly the early Bronze Age. However, we don't know if this was unique or regional in British islands or if it was widespread, as there isn't a lot of evidence of it until the Iron Age period where it does become widespread. But is that because we have a lack of finds, or is it because there literally just wasn't something commonly used? Some local culture was using it or saw it and decided that it was a great design choice, and then everybody started to use it. Or did they attach some sort of mythology to it that made it important to use? It was seen as a way to symbolically protect yourself by using the symbols of the gods or the ancestors or whatever you want to describe it as to protect yourself. Just think about it. If you're thinking about weapons, which often would have these designs, or shields or helmets or all of these things, are they being interpreted and put into these because not only because they look nice, but also because they're seen as symbolically protecting them? They're links to the gods. And this is where this whole thing that I've just spent the last little bit talking about as being possibly incorrect comes in, because you're trying to interpret, why is this happening? Why would all these people suddenly, in this period specifically, start to use this as a motif? Is it initially because it's a mythological reason and it becomes a design choice? Is it because people are fascinated with nature and so they want to show the links to nature? Think of, as an example, the use of, or as a more modern example, if you want to be truthful, the way in the Lord of the Rings movies, the swords that the elves had have a leaf motif, try and show that they had links to nature. And so it was a way of showing that design choice rather than a link to a god or a goddess. Whereas in that period, it may very well have a link to a particular worshipped deity that became worshipped across the entirety of Britain, and thus the reason for the motif. Or again, is it just strictly a case of maybe one person's mythology is another person's? Wow, I really like that. Think of the way we frequently will use Japanese kanji, or using pictographs or other things on tattoos, or using Viking writing to try and make things look cool, in quotes, and sometimes getting the entire statement or naming wrong. Or you can even look at examples in Japan where they've done similar things using English and the English comes out very weird. That is a idea that, oh, this either gives it some sort of authority or some sort of, it's a cool link to something mysterious rather than necessarily mythological or godlike. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. Sometimes people just don't understand the culture they're looking at and they interpret it as, wow, that looks really cool, I'm going to use that. Who knows if the original reason it was used was very much a very important and significant religious decision that then becomes a, hey, this looks cool. Don't know. Again, however, if there is one object that epitomizes Iron Age British craftsmanship, it is the torque. These elaborate neck rings, often made with twisted gold or bronze, or sometimes both, were symbols of wealth and power, and possibly even divine favor. The most famous example is the Great Torque from the Sedisham region, though Welsh examples such as the Rosset hoard provide significant insights into local artistry. The Rosset hoard, as an example, discovered in North Wales, contains gold and copper alloy torques that highlight the skill of the Iron Age smiths. The precise twisting of the metal and the symmetry of the design demonstrate an advanced understanding of metalwork techniques, and these objects were likely worn by high status individuals, possibly tribal leaders, warriors, or, if we're being truthful, also religious figures as a mark of prestige. Torques are rigid and circular neck rings. They were prominent in Iron Age Europe and particularly among Celtic societies. These ornaments, often crafted from gold, bronze, or silver, are notable for their intricate designs and the craftsmanship involved in their creation. Near Sedisham, as we mentioned, was found one of the finest examples of a torque, made from 64 twisted wires with hollow terminals cast on either end. It is known as the Great Torque. And if you see this particular example, it looks a lot like when you see wiring and you see it all wrapped together. It has very much that type of appearance, but tightly woven. So it's so tightly woven that it just looks like one band, but you can see there's individual pieces to it. It's an amazing piece, and I actually have pictures of it that I have taken in the past when I was at the British Museum. It is one of the most elaborate gold objects made in the ancient world, and it rivals pieces by contemporary Roman, Greek, and Chinese goldsmiths in its elaborate nature and its appearance. It is very similar to the Netherwood torque, which was found in Scotland, which demonstrates links between craftspeople across the British island. It is also in Scotland and Ireland where we see horse armor, which includes the torse pony cap, likely a part of a facial armor, which includes a slot for the horse's ears right about there if you're looking on video, but at the points where the horse's head, where the ears come through. These would eventually develop horns between the ears, which were then shaped quite frequently to look like small horns or goat horns, you might describe them as. And likely these were used more for decoration than for warfare, because you can imagine a horse butting heads with those things wouldn't necessarily go well for either horse. And I don't think it would make sense for the rider to do that when you've got other things that can attack someone without having to rely on a small 6-inch long horn. But in a case of last resort, maybe you would do that. I'm not too sure, if I'm frank. Like other British art, these typically had the swirling circles and twisting vines and leaf styles seen in other pieces. Gold, of course, was not as common as bronze, but when it was used, it signified something extraordinary. Many torques, of course, have been found in hoards with gold, suggesting that there may have been either put in as a votive offering to the gods or possibly protecting a valuable item, either to seek divine favor, protection, or maybe as a symbol of a successful harvest. It's hard for me to believe, though, that someone who was using this as a symbol of status would have buried this. It may have been something that was put into the ground after this person passed away, unless it was like a symbol of desperation. We need to get the gods on board, so I will cast off my most expensive item to try and get favor back with the gods. The primary function of torques appears to have been, as I said, status symbols and symbols of power. Worn around the neck, they were likely indicators of high social standing, wealth, or leadership within the community. The materials used, especially gold, underscore the prestige associated with these items. Gold, while it's not uncommon in Britain, was not the norm in what we have found, and it's usually a surprise when we find them. So the fact that they were so frequently used in torques does show that they were considered to be symbols of importance. Beyond their role as status symbols, torques may have held religious or spiritual significance. Word again. Some depictions of the deities from the period have adorned torques, suggesting a divine association. This connection implies that wearing a torque could have been seen as invoking protection or favor from the gods, or even as a symbol of one's own divinity or sanctity. And I'll add in there, or seen that You are the representative of that deity on earth, much like a pharaoh or religious leader would have been for other cultures. Numerous torques have been unearthed across Britain, offering insight into the distribution and cultural value that valued them. Notable among these include the Ipswich torques. In 1968, 5 gold torques were discovered near Ipswich. These artifacts dated between 150 to 50 BCE and are crafted from twisted gold bars with loop terminals. They are terminals that are decorated in the Latine style with the motifs that we've discussed, the various spiraling techniques. And they showcase an intricate artistry from that period. These torques are currently housed at the British Museum. The sterling torques, found obviously in Scotland, unearthed in 2009 near Blair Drummond. This hoard comprises 4 gold torques, including 2 ribbon torques and 2 with intricate designs. This discovery has been significant in understanding the reach and influence of Celtic art and the trade networks in ancient Britain. Because obviously, if something is coming from as far south as around London or even farther south, and now spread all the way up to the southern part of Scotland, there's definitely a massive network going on and a passing of cultural ideas that we are seeing. We've also mentioned, at least in passing, of the discovery of the Snettisham hoard and the Great Torque, which was found there. This site in Norfolk, England, includes a hoard of dozens of torques made of gold, silver, and surprisingly, electrum. Dating from the 1st century BCE, this collection is one of the largest of its kind and proves valuable insight into the wealth and craftsmanship of the located, possibly at that time, Iceni tribe. The design of the torques varied, but many featured twisting metalwork, loop terminals, and elaborate decoration. Techniques employed in their creation, such as the lost wax casting and twisting of fluted bars, highlight the advanced metallurgical skills of Iron Age artisans. For instance, the Ipswich torques were made by twisting 2 fluted gold bars together with terminals cast using the lost wax method. In other words, put them around in a wax thing that would be burned away as the gold itself was placed into it, and then adorned with the various motifs that characterized this culture. The recurring motifs in this art style, often interpreted as having deep symbolic meaning, possibly, and that's all we can say, possibly reflected religious belief. Triskeli, or the 3-legged design radiating from a center, is one such motif. Now, I've discussed the Triskeli earlier and what they may or may not have meant. Some archaeologists have interpreted these as symbolic and powerful objects of religious connotation, possibly representing relationships between the living, the dead, and the gods, or an ongoing cycle of birth, life, and death. And this is where I say that you have to take that with a grain of salt, but it certainly makes some sense. Stylized representations of people and animals became more common after 100 BCE, with the faces often hidden with complex patterns. Human heads surrounded by flowering plant-like designs can be seen on plaques from Talhil Llyn Hord, while a variety of cows, horses, boars, and birds adorned wide ranges of other artifacts. Now, keep in mind, this is at a time period where Rome is starting to rise up and it's having influence on its neighbors, including in Gaul. So you have that more anthropomorphic design choice now starting to spread amongst the cultures in various areas. And I think that's why you're seeing more of this design style change. Particular motifs and designs are introduced and often repeated, reinforcing their meaning. Archaeologists interpret these symbols with religious connotations, and all of this influences our interpretation from that. The crescentic plaque from Llincarrig Bach is decorated with elaborate triskele, and each limb ending with a trumpet and a raised circle suggest some sort of stylized bird head. These stylized representations would come to form things like the ox head escutcheons or bucket fillings. There has also been found in Wales boards that also contained two Roman trumpet brooches, indicating that this Celtic style continued to be in use after the Roman conquest, showing the stylized characteristics and flowing lines of native British artistic styles that were still in use at the time. Mythical beasts are often hinted at. For example, the imaginatively constructed horse-cow heads that ornament the Capel Garman fire dog. Celtic designs did not, of course, disappear with Roman conquest, but continued to influence the art of its people. A large bronze trullius, or saucepan, from the Coigan camp in Carmarthenshire was repaired with a sheet of metal sometime in the 3rd century CE, but it was not decorated with typical Roman design, but rather with the triskele motif, showing a continued appreciation of that art style. The creation of these intricate designs required advanced metalworking skills, as we've mentioned, and techniques that allowed decoration in relief, engraving, and inlay were commonly employed. These methods allowed artisans to produce detailed and decorative objects that were both functional and symbolic. Celtic designs did not disappear with the Roman conquest, as I said, but continued to influence the art of the area long after the fact. And with that, I should point out that there are, beyond that, painted art and other design styles and choices that we haven't really gone into, such as the way pottery was made and what was used in the creation of that, something that was an everyday item, which again was covered in different types of art styles that match up with this. But as you can see, as we get closer and closer to the Roman period, we're starting to see a influence that's coming from the continent, which is changing the use of strictly abstract style into a much more identifiable style of humanization or animation, which creates something very different. And as we get closer and closer to Roman Britain, that style obviously becomes much more common and much more in use. And with all that said and done, I'd like to thank you for listening or viewing today. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com, or you can reach out to me at any one of my social media sites on Blue Sky, on Instagram or X at Welsh History Pod, or on Facebook at facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. Or if you'd like to help out the podcast in all the things that we do, you can do so at patreon.com/Welsh History. Thank you, everyone. I hope you're having a wonderful day, and we'll talk to you again next time. Take care. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcast.com. Thanks for listening.